California, the 20th century. A young woman gazes out the window of a Greyhound bus, cataloging the images that captivate her. The oil refineries where the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers meet. The Golden Gate Bridge, barely visible in the foggy dawn. As a college student at UC Berkeley, she was supposed to be studying the classics. But in these quiet moments, she would discover who she is and what she would do for the rest of her life. How did Joan Didion find her passion? And what is it that makes her a writer? Find out. Read Why I Write by Joan Didion.
Life changes fast. Life changes in the instant. You sit down to dinner, and life as you know it ends. The question of self-pity. Those were the first words I wrote after it happened. The computer dating on the Microsoft Word file, notes on change doc, reads May 20th, 2004, 11:11 p.m. But that would have been a case of my opening the file and reflexively pressing save when I closed it. I had made no change to that file in May. I had made no changes to that file since I wrote the words in January 2004, a day or two or three after the fact. For a long time, I wrote nothing else. Life changes in the instant, the ordinary instant. At some point in the interest of remembering what seemed most striking about what had happened, I considered adding those words, the ordinary instant. I saw immediately that there would be no need to add the word ordinary, because there would be no forgetting it. The word never left my mind. It was in fact the ordinary nature of everything preceding the event that prevented me from truly believing it had happened, absorbing it, incorporating it, getting past it. I recognize now that there was nothing unusual in this. Confronted with sudden disaster, we all focus on how unremarkable the circumstances were in which the unthinkable occurred. The clear blue sky from which the plane fell, the routine errand that ended on the shoulder with the car in flames, the swings where the children were playing as usual when the rattlesnake struck from the ivy. He was on his way home from work, happy, successful, healthy, and then gone. I read in the account of a psychiatric nurse whose husband was killed in a highway accident. In 1966, I happened to interview many people who had been living in Honolulu on the morning of December 7th, 1941, without exception. These people began their accounts of Pearl Harbor by telling me what an ordinary Sunday morning it had been. It was just an ordinary, beautiful September day. People still say, when asked to describe the morning in New York, when American Airlines 11 and United Airlines 175 got flown into the World Trade Towers. Even the report of the 9/11 Commission opened on this insistently preeminatory and yet still dumbstruck narrative note. Tuesday, September 11, 2001. Dawned, temperate and nearly cloudless in the eastern United States. December 30th, 2003, a Tuesday. We had seen Quintana in the 6th floor ICU at Beth Israel North. We had come home. We had discussed whether to go out for dinner or eat in. I said I would build a fire we could eat in. I built the fire. I started dinner. I asked John if he wanted a drink. I got him a scotch and gave it to him in the living room, where he was reading in the chair by the fire where he habitually sat. The book he was reading was by David Fromkin, a bound galley of Europe's last summer who started the Great War in 1914. I finished getting dinner. I set the table in the living room where we were home alone. We could eat within sight of the fire. I find myself stressing the fire because fires were important to us. I grew up in California. John and I lived there together for 24 years. In California, we heated our houses by building fires. We built fires even on summer evenings because the fog came in. Fires said we were home, and we had drawn the circle. We were safe through the night. I lit the candles. John asked for a second drink before sitting down. I gave it to him. We sat down. My attention was on mixing the salad. John was talking, then he wasn't. At one point in the seconds or minutes before he stopped talking, he asked me if he had used single malt scotch for his second drink. I had said no. I used the same scotch I had used for his first drink. Good, he had said. I don't know why, but I don't think you should mix them. At another point in those seconds or that minute, he had been talking about why World War I was the critical event from which the entire rest of the 20th century flowed. I have no idea which subject we were on, the Scotch or World War I, at the instant he stopped talking. I only remember looking up. His left hand was raised and he was slumped motionless. At first, I thought he was making a failed joke, an attempt to make the difficulty of the day seem manageable. I remember saying, "Don't do that." When he did not respond, my first thought was that he had started to eat and choked. I remember trying to lift him far enough from back of the chair to give him the Heimlich. I remember the sense of his weight as he fell forward, first against the table, then to the floor. In the kitchen by the telephone, I had taped a card with the New York Presbyterian ambulance numbers. I had not taped the numbers by the telephone because I anticipated a moment like this. I had taped the numbers by the telephone in case someone in the building needed an ambulance. Someone else. I called one of the numbers. A dispatcher asked if he was breathing. I said, "Just come." When the paramedics came, I tried to tell them what happened, but before I could finish, they had transformed the part of the living room where John lay into an emergency department. One of them, there were 3, maybe 4, even an hour later, I could not have said, was talking to the hospital about the electrocardiogram they have seemed already to be transmitting. Another was opening the first or second of what would be many syringes of injection. Epinephrine, lidocaine, procainamide. The names came to mind, but I had no idea from where. I remember saying that he might have choked. This was dismissed with a finger swipe. The airway was clear. They seemed now to be using defibrillating paddles in attempt to restore a rhythm. They got something that could have been a normal heartbeat, or I thought they did. We had all been silent. There was a sharp jump, then lost it and started again. He was still fibbing. I remember the one-on-one telephone saying, V-fibbing. John's cardiologist said the next morning when he called from Nantucket, they would have said V-fibbing for V-ventricular. Maybe they said V-fibbing, and maybe they did not. Atrial fibrillation did not immediately or necessarily cause cardiac arrest. Ventricular did. Maybe ventricular was the given. I remember trying to straighten out in my mind what would happen next. Since there was an ambulance crew in the living room, the next logical step would be going to the hospital. It occurred to me that the crew could decide very suddenly to go to the hospital, and I would not be ready. I would not have in hand what I needed to take. I would waste my time, get left behind. I found my handbag and a set of keys and a summary John's doctor had made of his medical history. When I got back to the living room with the paramedics, we were watching the computer monitor they had set up on the floor. I could not see the monitor, so I watched their faces. I remember one glancing at the others. When the decision was made to move, it happened very fast. I followed them to the elevator and I asked if I could go with them. They said they were taking the gurney down first. I could go in the second ambulance. One of them waited with me for the elevator to come back up. By the time he and I had gotten to the second ambulance, the ambulance carrying the gurney was pulling away from the front of the building. The distance from our building to the part of New York Presbyterian that used to be New York Hospital is 6 crosstown blocks. I have no memory of sirens. I have no memory of traffic. We arrived at the emergency entrance to the hospital. The gurney was already disappearing into the building. A man was waiting in the driveway. Everyone else in sight was wearing scrubs. He was not. "Is this the wife?" he said to the driver, then turned to me. "I'm your social worker," he said, and I guess that is when I must have known. I opened the door and I seen the man in the dress greens, and I immediately knew. This was what the mother of the 90-year-old killed by a bomb in Kirkuk said on the HBO documentary quoted by Bob Herbert in the New York Times on the morning of November 12, 2004. But I thought that as long as I didn't let him in, he couldn't tell me. And then none of that would have happened. So he kept saying, "Ma'am, I need to come in." And I kept telling him, "I'm sorry, but you can't come in." When I read this at breakfast, almost even 11 months after the night with the ambulance and the social worker, I recognized the thinking as my own. Inside the emergency room, I can see the gurney being pushed into a cubicle, propelled by more people in scrubs. Someone told me to wait in the reception area. I did. There was a line for a minute's paperwork. Waiting in the line seemed the constructive thing to do. Waiting in the line said that there was still time to deal with this. I had copies of the insurance cards in my handbag. This was not a hospital I had ever negotiated. New York Hospital was the Cornell part of the New York Presbyterian. The part I knew was the Columbia part. The Columbia Presbyterian at 168th and Broadway. 20 minutes away at best. Too far in this kind of emergency, but I could make this unfamiliar hospital work. I could be useful. I could arrange the transfer to Columbia Presbyterian once he was stabilized. I was fixed on the details of this imminent transfer to Columbia. He would need a bed with telemetry. Eventually, I could also get Quintana transferred to Columbia. The night she was admitted to Beth Israel North, I had written on a card the beeper number of several Columbia doctors. One or another of them could make all this happen. When the social worker reappeared and guided me from the paperwork line into an empty room of the reception area, "You can wait here," he said. I waited. The room was cold, or I was. I wondered how much time had passed between the time I called the ambulance and the arrival of the paramedics. It had seemed no time at all. A mote in the eye of God was the phrase that came to me in the room of the reception area, but it must have been at the minimal several minutes. I used to have on a bulletin board in my office, for reasons having to do with the plot point in a movie, a pink index card on which I had typed the sentence from the Merck manual about how long the brain can be deprived of oxygen. The image of the pink index card was coming back to me in the room of the reception area. Tissue anoxia for greater than 4 to 6 minutes can result in irreversible brain damage or death. I was telling myself that I must be misremembering the sentence when the social worker reappeared. He had with him a man he introduced as your husband's doctor. There was a silence. "He's dead, isn't he?" I heard myself say to the doctor. The doctor looked at the social worker. "It's okay," the social worker said. "She's a pretty cool customer." They took me into the curtained cubicle where John lay, alone now. They asked if I wanted a priest. I said yes. A priest appeared and said the words. I thanked him. They gave me the silver clip in which John kept his driver's license and credit cards. They gave me the cash that had been in his pocket. They gave me his watch. They gave me his cell phone. They gave me a plastic bag in which they said I would find his clothes. I thanked him. The social worker asked if he could do anything more for me. I said he put me in a taxi. He did. I thanked him. "Do you have money for the fare?" he asked. I said I did. The cool customer. When I walked into the apartment and saw John's jacket and scarf still lying on the chair where he had dropped them when he came in from seeing Quintana at Beth Israel North, the red cashmere scarf, the Patagonia windbreaker that had been on the crew jacket on Up Close and Personal, I wondered what an uncool customer would be allowed to do. Break down, required sedation, scream. I remember thinking that I needed to discuss this with John. There was nothing I did not discuss with John because we were both writers and both worked at home on our days were filled with the sound of each other's voices. I did not always think he was right, nor did he always think I was right, but we were each the person the other trusted. There was no separation between our investments or interests in any given situation. Many people assume that we must be, since sometimes one and sometimes the other would get the better review, the bigger advance, in some way competitive, that our private life must be a minefield of professional envies and resentments. This was so far from the case that the general insistence on it came to suggest certain lacunae in the popular understanding of marriage. That had been one more thing we discussed. What I remember about the apartment the night I came home alone from the New York hospital was its silence. In the plastic bag I had been given at the hospital, there were a pair of corduroy pants, a wool shirt, a belt, and I think nothing else. The legs of the corduroy pants had been slit open, I suppose by the paramedics. There was blood on the shirt. The belt was braided. I remember putting his cell phone in the charger on his desk. I remember putting his silver clip in the box in the bedroom in which we kept passports and birth certificates and proof of jury service. I look now at the clip and see that these were the cards he was carrying. A New York State's driver's license due for renewal on May 25th, 2004, a Chase ATM card, an American Express card, a Wells Fargo MasterCard, a Metropolitan Museum card, a Writers Guild of America West card. It was a season before Academy voting when you could use a WGAW card to see movies free. He must have gone to a movie, I did not remember. A Medicare card, a Metro card, and a card issued by Medtronic with the legend, I have a Kappa 900 SR pacemaker implanted. The serial number of the device, a number to call for the doctor who implanted it, and the notation, implant date, 03 June 2003. I remember combining the cash that had been in his pocket with the cash in my own bag, smoothing the bills, taking special care to interleave 20s with 20s, 10s with 10s, 5s and 1s with 5s and 1s. I remember thinking as I did that he would see that I was handling things. When I saw him in the curtained cubicle in the emergency room at New York Hospital, there was a chip in one of his front teeth, I suppose from the fall, since there were also bruises on his face. When I identified his body the next day at Frank E. Campbell, the bruises were not apparent. It occurred to me that masking the bruises must have been what the undertaker meant when I said no embalming, and he said, in that case, we'll just clean him up. The part with the undertaker remains remote. I had arrived at Frankie Campbell so determined to avoid any appropriate response, tears, anger, helpless laughter at the Oz-like hush, that I had shut down all response. After my mother died, the undertaker who picked up her body left in its place on the bed an artificial rose. My brother had told me this, offended to the core. I would be armed against artificial roses. I remember making a brisk decision about a coffin. I remember that in the office where I signed the papers, there was a grandfather's clock, not running. John's nephew, Tawny Dunn, who was with me, mentioned to the undertaker that the dock was not running. The undertaker, as if it pleased to elucidate a decorative element, explained that the clock had not run in some years, but it was retained as a kind of memorial to a previous incarnation of the firm. He seemed to be offering the clock as a lesson. I concentrated on Quintana. I could shut out what the undertaker was saying, but I could not shut out the lines I was hearing as I concentrated on Quintana. Full fathom 5, thy father lies. Those are pearls that were his eyes.